Our study for today is Daniel. And Daniel's a fascinating character. And what we want to do is, I'm going to take a little spin-off on an approach. And I want you to be thinking of these things as we go through this so that it'll apply when we do our questions. And first, we want to look at Daniel. We're assessing where Daniel is. And that would be kind of his physical being, like where he's at physically. And then we're going to look at his determination, what drove him to do what he did. So he had a mental edge to him that just focused him in and locked him in on where he was going and what he wanted in his life. And then thirdly, he was fully engaged spiritually. He had a connection with God, and he was an interpreter. So we're going to look at that aspect of it. We're going to be covering him in three aspects: the physical surroundings and personally, his mental outlook and what he was focusing in on, and then his engagement spiritually with the Lord and with these kings that he dealt with. So our exegetical analysis starts with who wrote these accounts of Daniel. And most look to this book and say, Daniel probably wrote them. But there's a little glitch there in that some of the chapters are written in the first person, which would imply Daniel wrote them. And then there's other chapters that are written in the third person, implying that either Daniel was dictating to someone, or someone was taking this account and hearing these stories. And remember, we were saying that it's not like he had a word processor there and he could just go through this. So somebody collected some documents or heard these tales of Daniel. And another interesting side note is that the prophet Ezekiel, so if you've ever read the book of Ezekiel, which is not pleasure reading, it's not something you would sit down and say, hey, I think I'm going to read Ezekiel today. Because it's kind of, wow, there's thick and heavy and beasts and eyes and wings flying around, and you're going, what is Ezekiel talking about? And Ezekiel was a strange dude. So if he was in Babylon at the same time that Daniel was, he did some strange things. And Daniel was a committed Jew, and so Ezekiel was doing these strange things. He was prophesying about Israel, and good and bad. And so Daniel would have probably heard him, but there's really no mention or connection in that regard. So when did this occur? 605 BC is when Daniel was exiled, and he was taken by King Nebuchadnezzar, who came to Israel and took all the finest and the best looking young people there. And so Nebuchadnezzar, when he comes in, he goes in this line, he says, we're taking you, kill the rest of them, or leave you, whatever. He was just on a whim. It was kind of, you're at this guy's mercy. And so Daniel and his buddies, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which were the names that Nebuchadnezzar gave them, or their Hebrew names were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And so I don't know how they got all that, but Nebuchadnezzar was trying to transfer them into his culture and saying, these are my names. And the name he gave Daniel was Belteshazzar, which was Bel in regards to the god Bel, B-E-L. Where did this happen? Set in Babylon, capital of it's the most pronounced kingdom and just renowned. The Chaldeans had rule over everything. Nebuchadnezzar was one bad dude as far as coming in and conquering. He was the man. And Babylon is in what we would consider Iraq at this present time, and probably about 50 miles south of Baghdad. So let's look at these key events. And 3 sections in Daniel. And the first section is, the first chapter is kind of the introduction, just telling you the scenario, what's going on. And then test of character and development of prophetic interpretation skills, chapters 2 through 6. Fancy way of saying that it's just giving a good narrative of Daniel, what's going on in his life, and then the remaining chapters are all kind of heavy stuff. That's that end times thing that you're hearing, and people are saying, I want to get into some of these televangelists that you see. I've seen them since I came to the Lord in 1976. I've seen them on TV all those years talking about prophecy. I mean, they have committed their life to talking about prophecy, and so Daniel is one of their main guys. We look at some of the other events that are going on there. Daniel maintains his separation, even as a teenager. He decides he's going to eat a certain way. We're going to discuss that. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. This thrusts Daniel to the forefront in that he's the only guy that can interpret this dream. As a matter of fact, Nebuchadnezzar says, he's probably in this mentality of, he's got these magicians and these soothsayers and what they call the Chaldeans, and he's got all these guys around him that claim to have this in-tuneness with the gods, and he's about had it with these guys. So he goes and says, not only are you going to have to interpret my dream, but you're going to have to tell me what it was. That's it. Just tell me what it was. Well, they're going to go, well, wait a minute, King. Nobody's ever done this before. How are we going to... Shut up. Tell me the dream and interpret it. And if you don't do that, I'm killing all of you. Okay. That's kind of interesting. So that was the first dream. The second dream, the next event would have been the 3 friends of Daniel being thrown into the fiery furnace. And you're maybe thinking, well, where's Daniel when this happened? Isn't he around? Well, Daniel had this high position, and he was probably a diplomat to go to foreign kingdoms, and he might have been on the road at that time, and he was not there when Nebuchadnezzar came up with this great idea that everybody's going to worship this golden image that I have here. So Daniel would have probably been right there in with the 3 buddies of his thrown into that fiery furnace if he had been in the area. Nebuchadnezzar's second dream, big tree. He's the big tree. The tree gets chopped. He goes out into the wilderness, and he's crawling around like an animal. And so that's another interesting story. But he does get restored. And then Belshazzar's blasphemous feast, where we get the saying, well, the writing's on the wall. That's biblical. I'll bet you a lot of atheists and some of these people that disavow God having anything to do with society have said that writing, and if you go, well, you're talking about the Bible there, you know that. And I go, oh, what? The writing's on the wall. All right, Daniel in the lion's den, that's the one probably just about everybody has heard about, and there's interesting development there. And then the last 7 chapters are prophecies and visions. It's just talking about prophecies and visions, which is heavy stuff. All right. So the hermeneutics, how does any of this stuff apply to what we're talking about in our daily life? Because we want to draw off of this, and I think the reason we study the Bible and we look at any of these men is we're trying to come out of here and say, how does this apply to us? What can we get out of this to make our lives a little bit better, get a little bit closer to God? So why did Daniel choose these particular things that he talked about? Why does he even talk about these? Well, they're pretty renowned things that he has, so it's kind of nice. But you got to understand, and when we look at the Bible, sometimes we put these biblical characters high and lofty, and these are notable events. But the fact is, it occurred over 60 years. All right? If I span these events out over 60 years, maybe they're not so miraculous. If I had a miracle happen in my life, and we've all had some kind of miraculous thing happen in our life, and if we're not careful, we'll look back and we'll go, I forgot about that. That was 10 years ago that happened. And you go, God help me to remember those things that you really did for me. It meant so much to me at that time, but now it's kind of, eh. And so Daniel, I'm sure he's recording these, but these events over 60 years may not appear to be as miraculous as it, because you can write things off. When I was in that Daniel in the lion's den, when he's in the lion's den, they probably had fed the lions the whole time. Who knows? Who knows how they can rationalize? So he focuses on themes. Anytime you're reading any biblical passage or letter or book, you want to look at the theme. What's this author trying to put forth? Well, Daniel's talking about kings, kingdoms, dreams, and visions. And if we look down these statistics here, there's a total of, there's over 31,000 verses in the Bible. Daniel is over 350. That's 1% of the verses in the Bible. But the cool thing is that Daniel contains 27% of the verses that address dreams. And Daniel also includes 31% of the verses that talk about visions. So Daniel was kind of locked into this theme. He really wanted to talk about dreams and visions. Now, he had access to Genesis, probably, and so Genesis is the second leading book of talking about dreams. So maybe he had this gift. He locks into that and says, Lord, I would really like to be an interpreter of dreams. Sometimes these gifts come upon us, they just get thrown upon us, and other times it's something we say, I kind of desire that, and who knows whether it was the chicken or the egg first, whether you had the desire or you desired it, and God kind of blessed you with it, but I think it's a combination of things, because we gravitate towards the things that we're good at. And so if Daniel had this awareness, because it says right in that first chapter, he had an awareness of his dreams, his dreams and interpretations. It doesn't say he had done anything like that before, but he had an awareness of that. So how do these events apply to us? Who gives crap about any of this stuff? What does it mean? Does it make any difference in my life? All right, so that's why we're trying to do the physical, the mental, and the spiritual aspect and kind of draw it in. So the assessment. If we just do an overall assessment of Daniel's life, we look at him physically, and it says he was good looking and he was healthy. Mentally, he was focused, and he was spiritually called as an interpreter. So we'll have you guys do that little exercise on the worksheet, and we'll have to get those. They're in the cupboard over there. But there's a little exercise of doing that and how we line up with that. So physically, it says, Daniel, young man in whom there was no blemish, but good looking. That included his 3 friends as well. And that was one of the first requirements of the Chaldeans. That's the thing that was obvious. So they could just go down and look and say, this young man over here, he's a good-looking young man, and he's got no blemish on him. He's not limping or anything like that. We're picking him. Easy pick. And that's kind of how the world applies. We kind of size people up. What does it take us? 30 seconds. When I talk to teenagers about abstinence education, there's a statistic that goes, it takes us 11 seconds to figure out if we're attracted to somebody. And I always tell them, I say, you know what, I think that's kind of high, because how many times we're walking along and we think, boy, that looks really good, and then you get a little close and you go, boy, that doesn't look as good as I thought it was. And so they always get a kick out of that. But I think it doesn't take long for us to size somebody up. Boom, we know. Secondly, the mental aspect. They wanted these young people to be mentally zoned in. They wanted to be sharp. It wasn't anybody that could get by with this, so they had to do some kind of testing. Obviously, they had some kind of test and assessment that they could look at them, talk to them, and then go, yep, boy, these guys are in. The third aspect, they're not taken into consideration at all, which may be the most important one, which was the spiritual aspect. Daniel was pivotal in turning this whole kingdom upside down.